Good afternoon. Welcome to Ray Network meeting panel discussion on long-term perspective, next 10 years of European youth programs. We are live from Vilnius, Lithuania, hosted by our partner, Lithuanian National Agency. Ray Network has been having a very productive meeting last 2 days, discussing Ray findings, talking about methodology, how to research better, and planning for the upcoming years. It became a part of Ray Network meetings to have a panel discussion, inviting speakers, panelists, and to have a strategic discussion and to share it with those who are interested and cannot be with us here in our Ray Network meeting. That's why we are live in different parts of Europe, and we welcome all joining us from their offices, their homes, their mobile phones. And last year's highlight was someone was listening to the panel while riding a bicycle. So if you are driving or riding bicycles, listening to us, be safe and just listen. We don't have big statistical tables, but we will have a very interesting discussion. Today, we have very distinguished panelists. 2 of them are here with me in Vilnius, and 2 of them are in their offices, and they will be joining online. I see only 2, but we will have 3 speakers that will be online. Let me introduce the panelists first. On my left, we have Justina Garbauskaitė, PhD, the national researcher for Lithuania, but she has been the author of several research projects, reports, and analysis. It's a pleasure to have her and hear her opinions and analysis. And we have a familiar name for Ray Network and those who have been following Ray. We have Andreas Karsten, Ray Transnational Research Coordination, here with me in Vilnius. And I'm Özge Hanşanyova. I'm a part of the Ray Network facilitation team, and I will be hosting this panel. And online, in their offices, we have Álvaro González Pérez joining us from European Youth Forum, and he's the policy officer and funding Civic Space. And for anybody who's not familiar with the work of European Youth Forum, it is the umbrella organization representing the most number of organized youth organizations and national youth councils in Europe. And we also have Leonardo Dongiovanni, who is the program officer, youth policy and programs at the European Commission, DG for Education, Youth, Culture and Sport, and a good friend of Ray Network. He's always there to share our opinion. He follows our findings very closely, and in the past, he has been physically with us as well, but it's always good to see him. And we also have, as a panelist, Tobias Flessenkemper, a familiar name for youth work, who has been part of youth work for many years. And at the moment, he is the head of Youth Department, Directorate for Democracy at the Council of Europe. And it's good to have him back in the youth field, but he's been active on civil society, democracy, and many other issues. And we're very glad he will be joining us today. So, to give a little bit background when we're talking about the future, this is not the first time Ray is talking about future. It's been going on for some time. We have had the Ray Triangular Summit very recently, and then we have Ray STRAT think tank meeting. And in both of them, very in-depth analysis and discussions were presented. They came about. And these discussions and analysis were based on the Ray findings. And for anybody who's joining for the first time to our panel online, Ray Network conducts consistent, ongoing research on the impact of European youth programs. And now we wanted to share some of these findings, not the research findings, but the discussions, and today's panel is based on the Triangular Summit and some of the issues that were raised in Ray think tank meeting. And that's why we will be talking about the future perspectives from institutional, from strategic, even from budget and research perspectives. So let's start with our discussion by setting the stage. And Andreas, shall we start with you? As I said in the introduction, today's discussion is based on the outcomes and the main takeaway points from the RAY events, particularly talking about the Triangular and RAY START think tank meeting. Which challenges have been explored, what were identified there, and what are the main points that were raised by the participants?
Thank you, Özge, and welcome everyone. So the reason why we are doing these forward-looking exercises, in particular at this moment in time, is, of course, most people will know the midterm evaluations of the current generation of European youth programs and the beginning of the shaping of the next generation of the European youth programs. That's also why our panel is called The Next 10 Years. Because of that overall context, we organized these events, a Triangular Summit, which we've done a few times in the past, the last time though 2018, so it was a while ago, where we bring together policymakers, practitioners, researchers, program stakeholders around the European youth programs and the European youth field. And then for the very first time, we organized a much smaller think tank meeting with visionary experts and institutional colleagues and partners, including the Council of Europe, Youth Partnership, the European Youth Forum. And we were trying to distill the major dilemmas of our time for young people and youth workers in the youth field. And I've picked 3 for this panel. We have more, but I've picked 3. And I'm trying to think whether we can maybe organize a big statistical table to illustrate them. No, okay, so 3 of them. So the first one we describe, or we call the challenge of strengthening diversity while we are all navigating multiple crises, right? And these crises, the pandemic, the war, inflation, the climate crisis, and all the effects of these accumulated on us as humans in the field, on young people, organizations, the sector. How do we deal with that? How do we build resilience for our field and at the same time still make it possible to organize learning environments that are accessible to all, that reflect the diversity of young people and of Europe? And that's a struggle that we have at the moment, a struggle that we also see with currently the European youth programs attracting a higher proportion of very well-educated and relatively well-situated young people in both European youth programs, as we have just heard. So the first challenge is that, strengthening diversity while we navigate multiple crises. Then the second one is strengthening digital literacy while fake news proliferate. And we always call this in our field a double dilemma, because we know that we have a qualification challenge, that youth workers and social workers need to get better in terms of digital competence and media competence, but we also know that young people struggle with that. And we have, for example, seen and heard and read research from colleagues in Norway who trace this longitudinally over longer periods of time, that young people are fairly confident that they know how to identify fake news online, but then in reality, when challenged in doing that, they are much less great than they think. So there is an overestimation of their own skill there. And so how do we deal with that in the European youth programs? How do we train youth workers, youth sector professionals, and at the same time also help young people dealing with mis and disinformation? That's the second challenge. And the third one is maybe the smallest one and the one that we can most easily solve, namely how to strengthen democracies while democracies are getting weaker. And the reason why we perceive that as a challenge and define that as a challenge is because we know that over the past 2 or 3 decades, young people's trust in democratic institutions all over Europe has tanked. Not for all democratic institutions, but for some of them that are core to democracies. Parliaments, governments, political parties, and the press. There are others, the justice system, the police, education, the climate movement that young people trust very much, but there are some core institutions that they trust less and less and less. And at the same time, we see more and more young people entering the European youth programs with a motivation to tackle socio-political challenges. And how do we square that particular circle and maybe manage to use the European youth programs better to rebuild some of the trust in democratic institutions of young people? That's the third challenge, how to strengthen democracy while democracies are getting weaker.
Thank you, Andreas. These are all interesting topics that we deal at practice and policy levels at the same time. And speaking of policy level, I would like to turn to Leonardo. And from your personal, professional perspective, what are the key challenges that European youth programs will need to address in the near future, in the coming decade? By the way, as I mentioned, you participated in the Ray Triangular Summit. There were several issues that were raised there. Is there a particular one that you took back and the European Commission will need to face in the next 10 years?
Thank you for your question, which is quite, in a way, enlightening on what we need to do in the future. I think Andreas has already mentioned a few very concrete challenges that we will have to face in the future. Coming back to your question, actually, I would like to draw a link between what we discussed in the triangular meeting in Helsinki and what are the priorities set of the European Commission, because they happen to coincide to a large extent. And in this respect, I have to refer to a statement made by our President Ursula von der Leyen when she explained the priorities of her mandate, where she made very strong references to youth, to have a central stage in the future policy. For example, she mentioned that decisions taken today should not harm the possibilities of future generations. She also called for an increasing role of youth in the decision-making process, so to have young people having their voice there, and also the fact that young people should have greater responsibility. Now, this is a bit of the framework, and the question you are asking is how to turn this framework into the ongoing evaluations have already been mentioned. This is our starting point, and we really need to learn from them on how to possibly improve the programs in the current term, but for sure also improve them in the future term, in the next MFF. Which is starting rather soon, even if 2028 seems rather far off in the future. In fact, it will come quite quickly. Then, again, following up to the words of our President of the Commission, we are trying to increase the activities in terms of youth mainstreamings and youth participation. Which in concrete words, it means that young people should be involved in the policies and should have a saying and should have, let's say, a decisive saying on what is happening tomorrow. And then another important aspect is that, of course, we work on programs, but we also have a youth policy, and the two things should go really hand in hand. Here we have let's say, a nice coincidence which we should exploit, which is the fact that in 2028 we will have a new generation of programs and a new youth strategy. And of course, we should make sure that the two are very well aligned and very ambitious on both sides. And then I would like to conclude with what is not a challenge, but a very concrete need, which in the end is about budget. When it comes especially to programs, much of what we do or what we don't do depends on the budget that we have at our disposal. And of course, since discussions on the budget will now start and will in a way become quite hot in the near future, what we need to do now is to really put on the table what are the needs and what are the outcomes of our programs, and use them as a basis to have more resources at our disposal to make the programs even more successful in the future, and especially in the future MFF.
Thank you, Leonardo. And this Ray network represents research. We are dealing with that. Commission and the Council are the policy dimensions, but we are very glad to have Álvaro here, which his organization deals a lot and represents the practice organizations as well as following youth policy. So I want to turn to Álvaro and ask from the perspective of the European Youth Forum, how do you see these challenges? And especially both Andreas and Leonardo were talking about participation, civic engagement. So how does the European Youth Forum and your members look at these issues and challenges?
Yeah, thank you, Osihan, and thank you also to the RAID Network for inviting the European Youth Forum to this meeting. In the European Youth Forum, we see all these challenges impacting enormously civic participation and in general civic engagement of young people, although very differently. So we were talking also about misinformation, or Andreas mentioned misinformation. This creates a climate in which young people's online civic spaces are filled with half-truths or manipulated information for which they need competences to filter and identify that are not really addressed in all educational systems in Europe. There was a mention also, and this was also discussed in the Triangular Summit in Helsinki back in May, on the impact of crisis in the youth field, which is also disproportionate, and especially if we look at 3 different dimensions of resilience that currently are also being a bit more explored on civic space research, which are individual, organizational, and sectoral. So at an individual level, everyone here knows also how young people face multiple challenges, ranging from accessing decent working conditions or accessing the job market at all, having less established networks than more adult counterparts, in case also they are suffering, I don't know, threats or attacks, or living also higher periods of instability that are represented by, well, essentially transitioning from being dependent on your caretakers or your parents to becoming fully independent. But then we get to the organizational level, and youth organizations themselves are also more vulnerable to this crisis and instability because of the natural high turnover of the sector, the fact that they are relying highly on the work of volunteers, and also because of structural challenges associated to accessing funding, including, in fact, from the EU youth programs. And last but not least, when we get to the sectoral level, everyone here knows, and this is also something we have the eyes on, because the next budget of the MFF, or the next MFF and program budgets are going to start discussed now. The budget of the youth sector is one of the first to be put in question when austerity measures or state or EU level budget reallocations are on the table. And all these dangers also impact, and all these different dimensions of resilience also are at the core of the challenges of accessing the program by young people of different identities that face different structural barriers, mainly due to its intersectional consideration. So when we look at young LGBTI people, or young refugees, or young people with migratory experiences, or young people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, all of them are facing these challenges and are facing these challenges and not accessing these opportunities. But also they are not even able to access, in many cases, their own, to a certain extent, human and civil rights. And this is not just the result of them being, for instance, queer and young, or a refugee and young, but the unique lived experience that comes from facing those added challenges. And this is also something that needs to be addressed, especially when we look at the program. And last but not least, Andreas also mentioned before the wish of young people to address current socio-political challenges. And this is also something that is not just an important reflection at a general level of how can society also adapt to make sure that young people can participate appropriately, but also specifically when looking at the program, how can the program also change or adapt for young people to engage appropriately? Because when we look at the current program, since the Youth in Action was merged into Erasmus+, this has not been appropriately integrated. So Youth in Action was characterized by this equal focus on both non-formal education and individual skill development of young people, but also on the more organizational systemic development of the youth civil society and the youth sector as a whole. And today the focus is going mainly on individual competency development. And I have a very clear example, and I'm happy to have also this audience here because it's also quite technical, but it's still important. When we look at the key action 3 today, in the current iteration of the program, it barely has any weight. You have European Youth Together grants that are at centralized level, but at decentralized level, nothing is going on. And key action 3, as many of you know, is characterized by the support for policy reform. So at this moment, while the evaluation is taking place, what the results will tell is that key action 3 doesn't have a lot of weight. But then when we look at the change of the current iteration of the program, we have youth participation activities that arguably are actually also serving support for policy reform. But all the evaluation results will also feed into the value of the key action 1. And the reason that I'm bringing this up specifically now is that future conversations on how the program will be able to enable young people to address socio-political challenges are very closely linked to having a proper and all-encompassing evaluation.
You raised several issues, but also very valid points and criticisms. Evidence what as a result of the research what is gonna guide us for a better planned and efficient future. And I'm aware of Youth Forum also conducting its own research. I will come back to you on that. But some of the issues you have raised are very high on the agenda of Council of Europe. So let's go back to the institutional design, and let's give the floor to Tobias. You've been listening to our discussion, the challenges, and what is on the agenda of Council of Europe, and what are you putting your focus and energy on for the near future?
Thank you very much, and sorry for being a little bit late, but as you know, the Council of Europe is engaged in policy making with and for young people, and we had a negotiation which was reopened on our discussion on young people and climate. And so I was called to a meeting in the Committee of Ministers to see how we get that moving. Now, first of all, thank you very much for inviting the Council of Europe to be part of a discussion on 10 years of the European Youth Programs, or rather the next 10 years of the European Youth Programs. As you know, the Council of Europe youth sector is currently undergoing a moment of reform and re-strengthening. Number one, the Reykjavik summit, which was a summit of the heads of state and government, which was taking place in Reykjavik, Iceland last year, put youth back into the center of the Council of Europe political agenda, mainly linked with the agenda that Andreas mentioned, democracy. What is the role of young people in working on the continuous support to democracy being the leading model in the European region? Secondly, it was also to bring a new policy approach, which means the youth perspective. Just as we speak, a consultative meeting is held here in Strasbourg on how to bring the youth perspective to all deliberations and other actions of the Council of Europe, with the view of adopting a standard for the 46 member states on how to integrate youth perspectives in policy making and in the future of democracy. And thirdly, we're also obviously working in sync with the European Commission in cooperation, so the partnership with the European Commission, but also with the youth organizations represented by the European Youth Forum, which remains the critical partner for the Council of Europe youth sector, on revitalizing, if it were, the instruments. As you know, the youth sector has a very stable structure, and we would like to update and develop it for the future. So this discussion comes very, very handy. How do we do this? I think we still rely on what I call the Trinity, which is basically like a three-legged stool, which all carries each other forward, all elements, which is number one, provide a space, a physical space for youth policy to be made in the European Youth Center, which is a co-managed space. That's the second aspect. And to provide through the European Youth Foundation a critical instrument to fund at European level political engagement and societal engagement of non-governmental youth organizations and youth actors. And this is basically what brings the Council of Europe into the field and has brought it for many years. I think we'll have another round to say a couple of words on what we could envisage for the future cooperation with our strategic partner, the European Union, and the role of the youth programs. Thank you.
Thank you, and thanks for the good news. Some of these issues are music to the ears. And we're again coming back to the triangle of research, policy, and practice. I would like to give the floor to Justina, because all these preparations are made, criticism are raised, policy and tools of policy are being discussed. But what are the trends and signals do you see shaping the research in youth work? Or in a very practical point, what topics do you anticipate that will still be on the research agenda and what might no longer be there?
Okay, thank you. So first of all, I think that there are several topics that are going to be topical. The topics that we have to speak about and the topics that we have to research more. This is something that we see in young people, the eco-anxiety. It's a really important topic for them, so I think that we'll have to look into it a lot more closely. Then the other topic that we will have to focus on, and it's already ongoing, it has already started, is the inclusion of the program. How inclusive is the program and how we can make it more inclusive, and how the people who are not included, what the program could do to somehow invite them to be a part of the program. But this is, again, I think not very far future, it's a near future, if I remember correctly about what Ray is planning. And then I also think that what we need to look at in the near future are the new ways of being together that young people are experiencing, because the old ways of organizing young people into youth organizations or into being together in physical spaces or organizations and so on, it's diminishing. Young people are not that into commitment, long-term commitment to organizations. So I think that we also need to review the formats of the program and to research the new ways how the young people are spending their time, how they're organizing themselves in these new ways. And here the digital part will also be important. How do we access people who are organized in digital spaces, right? So I think that these are the things that, the topics that are coming. What will stay is digital is coming and will stay. Inclusion, learning, I think, is very important. We cannot exclude learning from researching the Erasmus Plus or European Solidarity Corps programs, and the impact definitely, because every time you will have to prove that the programs are working, the programs are doing good, they have a meaning in young people's lives. So to prove the impact of the program, I think we'll have to continue to do that. And what I hope to not be there, I hope that I will not have to research or over-explain to people what youth work is and what non-formal education is and what it is not. I'm really hoping for this to not be on our research agenda anymore in 10 years.
Thank you. Well, thinking about the future and the way you put it it reminds me of the words of Zadie Smith, that the past is always tense and future is perfect. So what you're hoping is hopefully we will get us there or not. But I would like to elaborate more and give more food for thought and for discussion to other panelists about the recent research projects you've been in. And you've been doing different types of research at different levels of analysis. And what are some key findings and implications for the future development of these programs, all the policy that is being designed, and again, for us to take a look at it?
Okay, so again, I'm going to come back into this new ways of being and new formats. I think that the program, since I have been involved with the program since 2007, I think most of the actions have not changed. There are some new actions that are happening, and I would question if the formats that we have currently, do they respond to the needs of young people? And also, I was doing a research with the youth workers and the trainers, and we were talking about the formats that they're doing within the program. And but what they said is the willingness to somehow create your own individual learning path. So the program allows that because it's a lot of short-term activities. But then the people who are involved into short-term activities, they lack depth. They say, okay, I have learned this, and this is usually very basic. So it's great for entry level, but then the program does the activities that are offered, they're not going in depth as much as they would like to. They're not learning advanced level things as much as they would like to, and there is a need from the trainers to be able to work on a more advanced level, and for the more experienced youth workers to further develop their skills, to not repeat the basic things. Also, so the flexibility of formats, the shortening of activities. There is this need to have shorter activities because life is very fast and people cannot commit to long-term activities. Long-term activity is 5-day training course already, so even shorter maybe. So this is from Erasmus program, and what I would also like to share is from a future study that we did on the school. We were developing several scenarios that could happen, and one of the scenarios was a school of individual meanings, which means that every individual will become more actively involved in non-formal education activities, and they will gather different certificates from different organizations, and then they will get a education diploma from gathering those. So this, I think, also means that there is some space for the program to grow into providing diverse learning opportunities for diverse people.
Thank you, Justina. It's very interesting indeed. And Álvaro, I'll turn back to you because we had a session before and you presented the findings of a very recent study by the European Youth Forum. Would you briefly highlight key themes and topics that emerged very briefly, but also how do you see the youth programs evolving, connect to these challenges and themes you have identified in your research?
Yeah, thank you, Osihan, for the question. Also, to put the question into a bit more context, currently in the European Youth Forum, we are conducting a research to understand the experiences of youth organizations with the EU youth programs. We presented some preliminary results from our survey in a session before. So basically the data that I'm gonna mention now is based on those preliminary results, but our report will be published rather in November. So if you are interested in this, you are also very much welcome to check it out once we publish it. I will stop at I will mention 4 topics that came up, linked also to some of the data and related, let's say, recommendations based on the work that we have done so far. The first one corresponds to governance and participation in the program. So in the survey, 62% of the organizations, and just to fully clarify, the respondents were all youth organizations or youth-led organizations. 62% of them agreed or strongly agreed that they had the opportunity to give feedback on the functioning of the youth programs, but the number decreased quite a bit to 45% when asked whether their feedback was taken into consideration. And the fact that less than half of the respondents who are the intended beneficiaries of the programs respond that their feedback is not taken into consideration, showcases the need to develop a more participative Erasmus Plus and European Solidarity Corps programs that is not built just top-down through the decisions of institutions alone, but that also take into account the needs and opinions of youth civil society. And we have been met often, particularly on EU institutions or even at national level, with skepticism when we have spoken about this. But I think it's worth mentioning that this is in fact a practice that is already been put in place for many, many years. And actually, this is happening in the institution that Tobias is representing within the Youth Department of the Council of Europe. You have the European Youth Foundation, which also manages its funding and its grants through the principle of co-management, in which member states and youth organizations are at equal level. This doesn't mean that this exact principle can be applied exactly as well on the EU youth programs, but it does showcase that there's a long way in which EU institutions and the programs specifically can actually catch up in terms of including youth civil society and young voices in designing the program, and not just as beneficiaries. The second point that came up also is linked to inclusion and diversity. So in our survey, 65% of organizations expressed that the funds gained through the EU youth programs allow them to support young people with fewer opportunities. And whereas this number is relatively high, it also does showcase that the remaining 35% did not have the chance to do so through two funding programs whose one of the main focuses is social inclusion. And when we look at the breakdown of the challenges, things also, they are not surprising, but I think it is also worth mentioning because then we have some data also backing it up, which is on the first one was the cost for external experts. The second one corresponds to barriers in obtaining visas and travel permits for participants that require so. And the third one corresponds to the cost of accessible accommodation for disabled young people. A concrete consideration to tackle this issue in the future programs, or these issues in the future programs, would be, for instance, to include more ambitious budgetary considerations and top-ups to facilitate inclusions of all young people, and also to adapt the projects rather on a needs basis. And it is also not surprising that the visa challenges came up so high, and this is particularly not striking when we talk about the European Solidarity Corps program, where this has been one of the main challenges that has been underlined, which is why in the European Youth Forum we are advocating for the establishment of an European volunteer status that can also, among other things, fast-track these visa procedures. One other point that will be a bit polemic, but nonetheless it's important to mention it here, corresponds to evaluations of project applications. In our survey, 71% of respondents stated that they strongly agreed that evaluations to project applications were conducted fairly, whereas the number dropped to 53% when asked if the evaluation were assessed by experts with good understanding of the youth sector. This also corresponds to data that we have gathered in the European Youth Forum, for instance, related to the drop of the number of youth organizations accessing European Youth Together grants, or even reports from a national level corresponding to higher challenges of youth organizations accessing the program, which does showcase that the process of evaluation at this point is missing a critical consideration for the youth sector. And this is why we are also calling in the European Youth Forum to, and it might sound self-explanatory, but to make that one requirement to hire experts assessing the projects that they are actually experienced within the youth sector. Secondly, that there are projects in common trainings implemented for the independent experts to ensure that it's a common understanding also, an equal understanding among everyone. And finally, that the contributions of the organizations, that the criteria, evaluation criteria also includes contributions of the organizations to the youth work ecosystem. We had also a lot about red taping, or rather high bureaucratic threshold of the program, and how especially youth-led organizations are experiencing higher challenges to access that. But I will stop at that.
Points, and I've seen a lot of people taking notes. This is part of the reality, and this appears on different levels of research. And speaking about research and future, I'll just take a step aside and also include my curiosity as a researcher and as an academic as well, and turn back to Andreas again, and especially in terms of RAY network, because all these issues being raised, all these topics, trends, challenges have been discussed. I have a simple but simple to ask, difficult to answer question for you. Is RAY ready for these future challenges?
Is RAY ready for these future challenges? I'm going to wiggle myself out of this one with yes and no. I think yes, to the extent that we understand that in the European youth programs and in the European youth sector, organizations, beneficiaries, the field is trying to find responses to the challenges I described in the beginning. And we are also mirroring that by trying to integrate these questions into research that we do. We have overhauled our surveys, for example, and have integrated new questions there that tackle some of these aspects. We are also currently thinking about starting new research projects. One we call RAY Miss, on who is missing in the youth programs and why. One that we call RAY Cope, could also call RAY Hope, probably, on building supporting, strengthening mental health and building resilience through the European youth programs. But then the no part of that answer is that we are also struggling with the question of whether or not we should do more research. And there is a part of our network that is hesitant about that, because we sometimes struggle in implementing the research fast enough and well enough. But we particularly struggle as a field in translating our research findings into program management and practice and implementation. But my call would be, it's foolish to say we stop doing research and start blindfolding ourselves. What we should much rather do is become more consistent and more demanding in building capacity to actually translate research findings into program management and practice. We need to make sure that in every national agency, there are people who have it as part of their work profile and their work contracts and their actual work time in reality to be able to work through and with research findings, ours as well as others, to improve and inform program management and implementation, and not become introverted and say we do less because it's impossible to work with the multitude of findings. These multitude of findings are important because they reflect the diversity and nuance of the field. What we need to make sure is that we can work with them in program and practice. And that's my call and plea, to make sure that in the next 10 years we actually work on that part after having worked a lot on our research methodology and research scope.
Thank you. All these talk about future as a distant object away, far from us, in reality reminds me of the words of the Polish poet Wisława Szymborska, where she wrote, "When I pronounce the word future, the first syllable already belongs to the past." So when we are talking about the future, it's already happening, and it's at the moment. And so much has been raised about the programs, the institutions in the future, but these were not created, or they will not be created overnight. They've been existing for a while. So I want to turn to Tobias, actually, on this issue, with considering his long-term engagement and experience with the youth policy programs and even institutions. And from a critical perspective, they seem very 1990s. So would you agree or not? And how relevant do you think they will be next 10 years? And what kind of strategic changes you think are necessary?
Well, please enlighten me. What do you mean is very 1990s? Exactly.
These discussions, some of these discussions have been going around. Some of the institutions were created in 1990s. Figuratively 1990s. I remember 1990s. But we've been always talking about future. In 1990s, we were talking about the future, which is now actually. And then these institutions, policies were created. And then do you think what strategic changes needs to be done, or we just leave them as they are?
Well,
give us a little bit strategic vision of your professional and institutional experience.
Well, I mean, I of course, as every human, I grow older, and I have been engaged in the youth sector as a youth activist, both in a voluntary and professional capacity indeed in the last decade of the last century. But then I didn't work in the youth field for 25 years, and I'm now, as part of my Council of Europe career, coming back to the field. And indeed, some of the discussions may sound similar, but at the same time, I've observed now, of course, also a lot of changes. And I think, however, there is a number of things which we should not forget, at least from where I speak from the European level. And we believe that at European level, of course, you need a certain level of organization. Because at European level, if you want to have democracy in Europe, and we know we need democracy across European countries, we cannot have neighboring states not being democracies. So we need democracy among the 46 member states. We also know that not everywhere things are perfect at the same time, but the togetherness at European level requires indeed European organization. And then there are two ways of engaging young people, and we choose in the Council of Europe the democratic option, meaning self-organized youth organization, youth councils, and other mechanisms, youth workers associations, etc. And why are we choosing this? And this was reconfirmed in Reykjavik, because the other options is you go for state solutions. States are running these affairs. And many of our member states had experiences in the 20th century that if the state gets too involved in youth affairs, that this is not a good thing. So there needs to be a balance vis-a-vis states engaging in youth affairs, or you give it over to the market. And you find market solutions to engage young people and to engage young people in all kinds of activities. And also here, there are obviously amazingly creative solutions that the market proposes. Justine was talking about, for instance, virtual spaces, which are mainly run by the market, even not European markets, but global markets. And there are solutions which are found there. But we actually would like to position things in the middle and saying, where is a space at European level where young people can meaningfully engage in issues? And when we look at what the Council of Europe can do, this is, of course, only one small element. Our strategic partner, the European Union, has contractual and treaty obligations vis-à-vis the member states and the citizens. And they have developed this set of programs which have gone a long way since they were first conceived in the 1980s, actually. And I feel when we look into what is now necessary from 25 to 35, with the new generation of EU subsidies being put out for activities, I feel we need to somehow look particularly on local effects, because that's where these things can happen very well. And at the same time, Europeanize the local effects. At the same time, we need to maybe look if the treaty basis is always the right one for doing exactly what has been identified by research. If we want to work on diversity and empower people of diverse backgrounds, is it necessarily youth exchanges that can only do this, or can it not be other things? Sorry, there's some people here.
Council of Europe is working, we can see that. So good,
Yes.
good. Don't worry.
But I'm sorry, yes, there are just people who are using this space where I am. And so maybe we have to look back into regional policies. We have to look back at regional cohesion policies, where actually youth issues can be dealt with. And we also need to look at particular policy efforts looking in the horizontal way when we look at the three things that Andreas mentioned, particularly the cyberspace, where obviously the youth programs themselves can only be a tool for addressing more important issues, but where young people could nevertheless play an extremely important role in shaping the cyberspace. And here we come back to this futuring of the youth perspective and looking into this. And we have to see if these programs are actually playing this role of empowering young people to shape politics and policies and outcomes. And here we, I think, have an open scenario in front of us. The Council of Europe will look at this in the next 10 years, how to strengthen democratic participation of young people and allow them to have meaningful outputs. And I know that the European Commission is also committed to making this happening. And we always encourage each other through the Youth Partnership to learn from the good practice. And we believe that some of the good practice is indeed coming here from the Council of Europe in terms of being a broader set of countries and also having a long-term established tradition of democratic participation in programming, which we still believe is one of the key standards. Maybe allow me one last remark on the future. The continent is undergoing real dramatic changes. Not only is the continent most hit by the climate crisis, there are a number of geophysical reasons about this, but secondly, of course, we have a war against our member state, Ukraine, and the reconstruction of Ukraine and what it means for young people in Europe to live in a continent where war, reconstruction, and maybe other conflicts in the neighborhood will shape their view on what Europe's reaction is. So we need to design programs that take seriously the life situations of all young people in Europe and also allows young people to build bridges, for instance, across the Mediterranean to our neighbor states, which are very young states, very big states, and which bring a lot of positive energy also for the European project. So if you look at these three dimensions, it's really something to do about methodology at European level. What do we need to do at European level? But also, how do we make European ideas useful at places where young people live? And thirdly, where we look at these huge policy challenges I mentioned, obviously the cyberspace, secondly, the climate crisis, and thirdly, of course, questions of war and peace, not only on the European continent, in candidate countries of the European Union like Ukraine, but also in our neighborhood in the Mediterranean.
Thank you. Let's continue with the strategic vision, but keeping in mind that we're coming to the end of our allocated time. But Leonardo, I think this is the moment where we would like you to step in and share a little bit with us the strategic vision of the European youth programs. What changes you think are necessary to cope up with these issues being raised? And I will put a tiny additional question about it, which you already opened the door about the funding and the money, because we need money to realize those things. So the strategic vision, what long-term changes are necessary in the European programs? I'm sorry to push you in about time, but if you can briefly talk about it.
Yeah, I can be very quick on this because actually part of the answer was already given in my previous intervention. As I said, I think it's right to talk about funding now. Of course, as you said, I opened the door, but the door cannot be completely open at this moment in time. Why? Because a new commission is not yet fully in place, so there will be confirmation hearings in the coming weeks. And at this moment in time, it's absolutely impossible to even think about a possible funding dimension of the future programs. So that's why I think the funding issue is an element we have to keep in mind, because it's in a way also decisive for the success of the programs. But for the quantification, I think this discussion will have to wait a couple of months, if not 1 year. Then what can we do now? We have the evaluations ongoing, and I think this is a good basis to check the temperature of the programs, see where we stand, what we are successfully implementing, and what we can improve. I have also listened very carefully to what Álvaro was saying on the research activities, and since I'm directly involved in the evaluation of the European Solidarity Corps, there I could find some, let's say, familiar points mentioned by Álvaro, which in a way will not be surprising for you to learn as an outcome of the evaluation on the European Solidarity Corps. Just to give you an example, a better understanding of specific needs of people with fewer opportunities. I heard that you also mentioned the visa issue. Surprisingly, no one mentioned the IT issue in this discussion, but it's something we keep in mind, and we know that needs some kind of improvement in the current program and in the future one. Then, of course, we need to align better funding and goals of the program. So there are a series of elements which we are using as the, let's say, the building blocks for the future program, and this is what we can do at this moment in time. And then the discussion on budget will come. And then, of course, I have to say that the work on the future programs will follow naturally after the evaluation. It will be in 2 stages. Let's say one will be about the let's say building the legal framework of the future programs, and this will keep us busy during the year 2025. And then we will work more on the, let's say, on the technicalities of the future programs, including indeed the development of calls for proposals, IT issues, management of the programs, and so on. And this would be for later. And what I can say to conclude is that, of course, stakeholders are being fully involved, be it at NGO, organization, NA, national authorities level, both in the evaluation, and they will be involved in the shaping of the future programs. So what we can call now is for evidence and impacts of the current programs and ideas on what needs to be better implemented for the future programs. And I hope I was short enough.
Yes, thank you, and it was informative. Speaking of short, then considering our remaining time, I will give the floor to remaining 3, Álvaro, Justina, and Andreas, to deliver one key message to people who are here in the room, RAY Network members, but also people who are watching us online. Álvaro, what would be the key message that you would like to share on the future of youth programs?
Thank you, Osehan. Well, I was having my head on the long-term strategic changes, so I will keep it also quite short. So firstly is let's be ambitious and increase the budget of both programs. I'm just going to drop here that in the Draghi report, even though it's focused on competitiveness, he's calling for a 5-fold increase of the Erasmus Plus program, but also not just it's not just about money, but putting the money where the mouth is. So we need to ensure also that this budget is also has an earmark for the youth sector. We are calling for a 15%. Just very briefly, but a second one would be there's a lot of conversations going on right now on the EU youth programs, and I say it in plural because there's the conversations are around whether to merge the European Solidarity Corps and the Erasmus Plus, and this is also a very strong message that we want to also translate on the side of the European Youth Forum to everyone that is listening us, which is that we believe that there's a very strong value in keeping both programs separate, and having a program as European Solidarity Corps that is also making sure that youth volunteering opportunities are accessible for everyone in Europe. And last but not least, and I think many people here might be also familiar with this topic, which is that we need a more clear and established youth chapter of the Erasmus Plus program. I was mentioning before about Youth in Action merging into Erasmus Plus and some of the youth considerations getting lost. But this is something that we definitely need to tackle and make sure that we shift the focus from individual skills development into a more civic space support that this program definitely has the potential to foster.
Giving bullet points that you don't see, but in the room a lot of people were taking notes of this. Andreas, what will be your key message before we conclude?
Oh, a very similar one. Even though in research we always focus on the things that could become better and that we could improve, what we can and always do show with the work that we do is how well the European youth programs actually work, how powerful of an instrument they are, and what we would recommend, demand, and suggest is that policymakers indeed do what Álvaro says, put the money where your mouth is. We have heard a lot of commitment to young people in the new letters and speeches of the Commission President at the Reykjavik Summit. What we now would expect to see is that these programs are allowed to scale and are allowed to do better and more what we know they do extremely well, because the question of accessibility and of diversity is not a technical question of us not being able to find young people in Europe, it's of us being able to do more activities of that kind in the European youth programs.
I'm thinking from the research perspective, and I wish for more research that is done with young people, not about young people, but together, co-created to actually know where they're standing and to broadcast this more broadly.
Thank you. And we're done with the time allocated for technicalities. I would like to thank Leonardo and Tobias and Álvaro for joining us, giving us your time. Your contributions are highly appreciated and really welcomed. And let's have a round of applause for our participants. And we don't have to have a live panel to meet with you. You know, you're always welcome, and you are part of the RAIN network, and to hear us, and we're curious hearing you. So hopefully next time we'll be in person together. And Andreas and Justina, thanks for the preparation, and keep up the good work. And thanks to everybody joining us online and here, and I hope that you found it as useful as I did. So I'll end the panel here, and thanks for everybody for listening to us.
Thank you.